Hey, folks. So today we're going to pick up from where we left off on our discussion of the persistent questions about the mind. Now that we've covered some of the basics about the ways of thinking and some of the important questions about human behavior, let's take a look at what comes before the establishment of psychology as a science in the 1800s. So, for most of human history, or for most of human existence, rather, we're kind of left to our own devices to speculate what really, really ancient man thought about the human mind because, well, they didn't write any of it down. So, Homo sapiens have been around for about 250, maybe 300,000 years, give or take about 50,000 years. And we only really started writing in the last few thousand years of that, right? So that means that the vast majority of human existence is something that went fairly undocumented, except for certain forms of cave drawings and things like that. We know about them through their tools, we know about them through archaeological evidence, but not a whole lot that was written down primarily. But they must have thought something about the human mind because they were able to work in pretty big groups, right? Most primates work in groups of about a dozen. So how are humans able to work in groups of about 150, right? Well, that takes a lot of knowledge about how people think and work. It takes a lot of curiosity about what your neighbors are thinking and what your neighbors are doing in order to form coherent social bands. So that had to be on their mind, but we don't really know that much about it. And the earliest pieces of writing, well, they don't really give us a whole lot of clues into what the average person thought about the philosophy of mind because they're pretty straightforward. The oldest piece of writing that we have in any language is a grocery list. So, if you think about the way they would have to write back then, with the clay styluses and with the clay tablets and the styluses, in cuneiform. You didn't really spend a lot of time philosophizing. You either kept, lists and tallies, or maybe you recorded how many people your army slaughtered in the latest war. But there wasn't a whole lot of philosophical thinking before then, or even the concept of philosophy the way that we use it today. There were some anecdotes about scientific thinking and thinking about the mind. There's a story that Herodotus tells about a king in what is now modern day Egypt, who and the claim was that he had ordered two children to be raised without any language, so their parents could feed them, care for them, all that. They just couldn't speak around them. And this king wanted to know what the original language was, and he thought whatever that the language that these kids developed must be the original language. And according to this anecdote, the first word that one of the kids said was the Phrygian word for bread. And so it led the king to conclude that Phrygian must be the oldest language. Now, this is almost certainly just BS, right? So this is Herodotus writing 200 years after the fact of when it was supposed to happen. There's no primary sources for this. And there's no evidence that this study was ever really carried out. But sometimes it's cited as the first experiment because it at least establishes this kind of curiosity about, hey, what happens to people if we do this to them, right? That experimental mindset. Now, a lot of writing, a lot of thinking was very straightforward prior to the 6th century BC, but around the world, or at least around the Eastern Hemisphere in 6th century BC, we see many advances in thinking and in culture, primarily coming from Asia and from the Mediterranean. So the 6th century BC is around about the time that an Indian prince named Siddhartha Gautama becomes disillusioned with Hinduism as it was practiced at the time, goes and meditates under a tree for 30 days, supposedly, or maybe it's more longer than that. But he meditates under this tree until he comes to some realizations about human nature and founds a school of thought that we now know today as Buddhism. In China, Kongfuzi, which means Master Fuzi, if I'm remembering correctly, or is it Master Kong? Don't quote me on either of those things. We know Kongfuzi as Confucius. So Confucius stressed the importance of order and planning and harmony, right? That the soul of culture and the soul of civilization was to be found in something being lawful and orderly and respectful. Now, in Greece, there was a new discipline emerging. We know it as philosophy, but it went by a whole lot of other names at the time. We'll go with philosophy, though, just because it's the most familiar. So, regardless of the origin of these schools of thought, regardless of how correct or incorrect they ended up being on certain points, they were all seeking to understand the causes of behavior, just like psychology does. The main thing that differed was their methods and the knowledge that they were working with at the time. We have to keep in mind, right? Knowledge is always incremental. So you have a thinker who might be putting out a lot of ideas. Some of them might be right, some of them might be wrong, but there isn't at first a lot of focus on experimentation the way we do today. A lot of the focus instead is on authority and rationalism. So, how do you interpret what some expert says, and how do you apply that using your logic and using what you already know about the world? So, some of the origins of Greek thought come from a philosopher known as Thales of Miletus. Now, we say Greek, but he was actually from modern day Turkey. So, Greece and Turkey are very close to each other geographically. There's a lot of interchange there. And one thing that we'll see in this lecture is that a lot of advances in thinking happen when there's interchange between two cultures. Sometimes that's peaceful interchange, but not always. So, Thales was one of the first Western thinkers to explain natural phenomenon in natural terms rather than relying on mythology. Now, this doesn't mean that Thales was an atheist. Pretty much all of these ancient philosophers that we're going to talk about in this first half of today's lecture believed in gods and believed in the souls, and they only really differed on what they thought the nature of the gods were, what the nature of souls were. So he believed that everything had a soul, right? Every rock, every tree, every plant, every animal has a soul, not just humans. And he was possibly one of the first people to formulate a mathematical theorem. Speaking of mathematics, one of these early thinkers, Pythagoras. So we know him because of the dreadful Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared on a right triangle. If you ever, for some ungodly reason, have to find the hypotenuse of a right triangle, it's been a while since geometry for me. But not only was Pythagoras a mathematician, he was also kind of a mystic too, and sort of a very modern thinker, even by our terms. So he believed that men and women had equal rights in a time when misogyny was just kind of the order of the day. He believed in reincarnation and vegetarianism. He said, when we die, we don't just go to Elysium or the Hades, the way that most of the ancient Greeks thought that was their heaven and hell, respectively. He thought we're reincarnated. Now, we might be reincarnated as animals. And if that's true, see where this train of logic is going. If we believe that we can be reincarnated as animals, that must mean that animals have some kind of full and thriving spirit or soul. And if they have a soul, well, maybe we shouldn't eat them. Right, so those are the thoughts that he came to based on his sort of, we might call them mystical beliefs today. And he was one of the first to suggest that the earth was round rather than flat, and also practiced arts that were related to trying to tell the future. You see this a lot, even through the Renaissance, even through the early modern period, that a lot of these thinkers and philosophers who came up with some very bright ideas also had some ideas that we might not consider scientific today. They were just interested in a lot of things. Some of those things, like the earth being round, turned out to have a lot of merit in them. Some of the things, like being able to read tea leaves or cast bones to tell the future, might not have had a lot of merit in them, right? So we start seeing why some school ways of thinking might be considered more scientific, and some today might be considered more pseudoscientific because some had more explanatory power and predictive power than others, at least so far. Heraclitus was another one of the important philosophers at the time. He believed that the only constant in the world was change. He said, no man can ever step in the same river twice. So, in some ways, that's true from two different senses. In one sense, it's not the same river, right? But the particles are different. What might be in the river might be different. But is it also even the same man, right? If you're thinking about the way that you were 10 years ago, the way you were 20 years ago, how much of that person is still around in you today? There might be some of it still there, but you've also grown and changed since then. So even though I might think of myself as this continuous entity that is Stephen Briner, how much of Stephen Briner from when I was 5 years old is still here now that I'm 39? One of the biggest influences in Greek philosophy is Socrates. So Socrates is famous for saying, "Know thyself, the unexamined life is not worth living." And rather than thinking of yourself as someone who's smart, Socrates said, think of yourself as somebody who's ignorant and then start from there. You might be this great scholar, this wise scholar, but you have to assume that you're ignorant. Socrates compared the mind to a chariot being pulled by two horses, passion and reason. So we start seeing here the beginnings of something called dualism. This difference between, say, the spiritual world or the world of reason on one end and the physical world and the world of passion on the other end. And also note, throughout history, different philosophers have compared the mind to whatever the most complicated piece of equipment around is. So in Socrates' time, think about a chariot, something that you can sit in that's got wheels. You don't have to ride the horse, and you can use it in war. You can use it for travel, but it's also kind of complicated because you got to make these two horses do the exact same thing at the exact same time. I don't know if you've ever tried it before. I certainly haven't, but I've been told it's kind of a task. So, we have this kind of thing that's hard to work and complicated. So philosophers might compare the mind to it. He believed that knowledge was innate, that we're all born with certain kind of knowledge in our brains, and it takes the right sort of education to pull it out of us. That's what the Socratic method is. The teacher feigns ignorance, pretends to be ignorant on a topic to try to get the student to come to the answer on their own. Now, he didn't write down any of his teachings. This was very common for a lot of thinkers in the ancient world, right? As far as we know, Jesus didn't write down anything either, right? Because the method of communicating through dialogue was sort of this art form of its own. And so you might have some people who wrote this stuff down and some people who might have focused more on dialogue. So most of what we know about Socrates comes to us through his students. And his most famous student is Plato. So Plato continued Socrates' work on reason versus passion and came to the conclusion that the soul has three parts. There's reason on one hand, which is good, and spirit and appetite, which is not so great. And the point of existence for Plato was learning how to control those spirits and appetites in order to focus more on reason. Aristotle, in turn, was a student of Plato's. So, whereas Plato thought that we could come to the truth through introspection and sort of reason alone, Aristotle, on the other hand, thought, no, we have to get in there and really understand physically what's going on before we can have a real idea about it. We can't just rely on logic and rationalism alone. We need to think about the actual physical nature of something. So that led him to believe that all physical sensations must precede thought. If you can't sense it, then you can't think about it. In other words, you have to go out and directly experience something before you can truly understand it, according to Aristotle. He was one of the first to understand that repetition improves memory, right? You think about trying to remember a grocery list, it might be butter, eggs, milk, salt, butter, eggs, milk, salt. And the more you repeat that, hopefully, the better it is, the better you are at remembering. He's one of the first to suggest that there's a connection between dreams and memory, which is a commonly accepted theory for dreaming now. But he wasn't right about everything. So when it comes time for the discussion, it's cheating to use some of these, remember. So he claimed that a memory would be more accurate if it was, he claimed to be he claimed that memories were more accurate if they were emotional. That's not the case. Just because a memory is emotionally vivid doesn't mean that it is true. He also claimed that catharsis helped purge negative emotions. Like, he believed we go to a violent play, we watch a violent thing happen, and therefore it makes us less likely to act out violently in the real world. Now we know, if anything, the opposite is true. The more you engage with some kind of violent undertaking, even if it's not going out and punching somebody, it might just reinforce you to be more violent in the future. In other words, you punch a wall enough times, instead of punching a person, that's going to eventually lead to you punching a person. He also believed the heart was the center of intelligence. He didn't realize that it was the brain. He thought the center of intelligence must be in the heart rather than the brain. Compare that to Hippocrates, who believed that the brain was the organ of the mind, not the heart. Now, Hippocrates believed that we were controlled by four fluids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, which are sort of related to earth, air, fire, and water, right? So the four elements. Now, in the Middle Ages, sorry, in the Roman era, after the rise of Rome as this very imperialistic state that starts taking over the Mediterranean and then the Levant and then Europe after that, we see them largely influenced by the Greeks in their thought, a renewed interest in dualism, and the vastness of the Roman Empire led to a greater exchange of ideas from other thoughts and other cultures. So again, we see the idea of cultural interaction leading to advances in thinking. For example, Galen was one of the first to suggest that you could dissect an animal to learn more about humans. That wasn't altogether obvious before, right? Lots of people, reasonable people, believed that animals and humans were completely different things. So what could you learn about a human by looking at an animal? Well, turns out Galen learned a lot, especially about the cranial nerves, the structure of the brain itself, how the right half of the brain and the left half of the brain are connected to each other. Now, he was working with Hippocrates' theory of those four humors and came up with four different personality types. He said the sanguine personality types have too much blood, those who are phlegmatic have too much phlegm, those who are choleric have too much yellow bile, and people who are melancholy have too much black bile. So I'll upload some supplements that explain more about these personality types from Galen's point of view. If we think about this, some of these ideas lasted well into the modern era. Why did doctors use leeches so much? Why was George Washington bled to death by his doctors? Well, some of them were still working on that theory that health problems would sometimes be caused by, say, having too much blood. And maybe if we reduce the amount of blood in your system, maybe that could help you out. Let's give it a shot. Also in the Roman era, Paul of Tarsus, we might know him as St. Paul. So not one of the original apostles. He was originally part of the Jewish faith. And we have to keep in mind, now, when we talk about Christianity, I want to stress, I'm not making any commentary or stating any opinion about the divinity of Christ or the existence of God or the existence of an afterlife. We're just looking at the thinkers who are coming from that tradition and what we know about them and what we know about those ways of thinking that surround it. So St. Paul, originally a Jewish citizen of the Roman Empire, becomes converted to Christianity. And converted here, we have to keep in mind that Christianity at the time would have been considered another sect of Judaism. So before Paul and the events that are depicted in the book of Acts in the Bible, Christianity is mainly a subset of Judaism. There may have been a group of people who we would now think of as Christians who believed that Christ was the Messiah, believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they still kept kosher and circumcised for religious reasons and observed Saturdays as the Sabbath, etc., etc., etc. What Paul starts doing, along with a handful of other apostles, is bringing the ideas of Christianity to the non-Jewish world. And here again, we have an instance of cultures interacting and producing these advances in thinking. So Paul, for example, is influenced by dualism and the Greek thinkers who were very heavily ensconced in that world. So this is all throughout Paul's writings, right? The idea that the spirit is good and the flesh is bad. He says, yeah, people can get married to avoid committing the sin of lust, but it would be better if nobody married. That way you could avoid all of this grossness of the flesh. So Paul's very dualistic in his thinking. St. Augustine is another of these early Christian thinkers coming from the Roman Empire, coming at a point where Christianity is becoming more and more widely accepted outside of its origins within Judaism. We're talking around about the time that Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, St. Augustine believed in free will. It's one of those persistent questions we talked about last time. Does mankind have free will? St. Augustine says yes. In order for heaven and hell to make sense, people must be able to freely choose their actions, including choosing evil at the forfeit of their soul. He believed in introspection, that the truth can be found by looking within oneself. And that is something that will become important once again when we look at people like Wundt and Ebbinghaus, who were part of the early school of psychological science that we'll see later on in the 1800s. Okay, when we pick back up, we're going to talk about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, and how the Crusades and the Reconquista eventually gave rise to a renewed interest in classical forms of thought. So that's where we'll pick up next time.